The gown was heavier than she imagined. It pulled at her shoulders, dragging her small frame toward the floor, its embroidered lilies catching the pale winter light that slid through the high windows. Aveline's breath fogged the cold air, though the chamber was crowded with bodies. She could hear the rustle of skirts, the low murmur of voices, the click of pearl beads against one another as a maid adjusted the headdress that pinched against her scalp. She was 9 years old, and today she would become someone's wife. Outside the chamber, the palace hummed with a strange anticipation. Pages hurried down corridors with rolls of parchment. Servants carried trays of spiced wine. Somewhere, in a hall she had never been allowed to enter, men bent over maps and seals, their laughter sharp and certain. They were not speaking of her, not as a child. They were speaking of her as a treaty, a ledger entry, a guarantee. You have to wonder how many others were dressed this way before they could even name the parts of the dress they wore. How many other royal children were taken from their games, their tutors, their mother's arms, and placed into a life that would not let them breathe. If you want to uncover the hidden fates of these forgotten brides, subscribe now and stay with me until the end, because you'll see how Aveline, the silent bride they thought they could break, became the shadow that made them tremble. The scent of lavender water clung to her sleeves, masking the musty odour of the gown's stored fabric. When she turned her head, she could see her mother, Queen Isabeau, standing near the fire with her hands folded. The Queen's gown was sapphire blue, her veil catching the light like a blade. She did not smile, she did not speak, but her eyes flicked over every movement, the lacing of the bodice, the fastening of the gold belt, with the sharpness of a commander reviewing soldiers before battle. Aveline lowered her gaze. She had been taught not to hold her mother's stare. Lady Helene de Brissac, her lady-in-waiting, adjusted the velvet underskirt, her touch gentle but quick. "Hold still, little dove," she murmured, so softly that only Aveline could hear. The girl obeyed. She always obeyed. From the window she could see the cathedral spire piercing the morning mist. Bells would soon toll, calling the city people to watch her walk, not to celebrate her youth, but to witness her usefulness. She'd been told her betrothed, Prince Lucien of Dreux, was 17, a man already tall enough to look down on her without bending. She had seen him once in the great hall, his hair the colour of wheat before harvest, his smile thin and quick to vanish. Margot of Calais, the senior servant, entered with the wedding veil folded in her hands. It was sheer as frost, its edges stitched with silver thread. She placed it over Aveline's head without a word. The fabric softened the world, turning colours to haze and voices to distant echoes. The door opened. A chamberlain bowed low, announcing that the hour had come. Aveline stepped forward. The gown dragged behind her, whispering over the stone floor. Each step carried her farther from the safety of childhood and deeper into the hall where men waited to claim her silence as their victory. She didn't know then that silence could cut sharper than any blade, but she would learn, and so would they. The first weeks in Dreux passed like a slow tightening of cloth around the throat, not enough to kill, but enough to make every breath measured. The palace here was darker than Montclair's, its walls of blackened stone drinking the winter light. In the women's quarters, footsteps were muffled by thick rugs, and the air smelled faintly of wax and starch. The laughter of men echoed from the great hall, but here, in the narrow rooms reserved for wives and daughters, voices dropped to murmurs or disappeared entirely. Lady Helene moved through these halls as if she had always belonged. Her skirts brushed softly against the rushes, her head bent in the practised curve of deference. She was no longer only Aveline's attendant, she was her guide into the quiet. "Watch before you speak," she told her, adjusting the folds of Aveline's new gown, a pale blue satin that itched along the seams. And when you do speak, smile first. It disarms them. It's what keeps you safe. The other women obeyed without question. They sat with hands folded, their eyes fixed on embroidery hoops or half-finished lace, nodding when spoken to. Their words, when they came, were soft and harmless. Compliments, inquiries about health, questions about the weather. No one asked where they'd come from. No one spoke of mothers or sisters or the children they had left behind. Aveline studied them. Some had been beautiful once, but their beauty had been smoothed into something ornamental, like the polished marble busts lining the gallery, perfect, unchanging, and lifeless. Others looked older than their years, their skins sallow under layers of powder. All of them smiled the same way, a small upward turn of the lips, showing no teeth. Prince Lucien entered the women's hall only when duty required it. He would stand in the doorway, one hand on the pommel of his sword, his eyes sweeping over them with the detachment of a man inspecting livestock. When his gaze landed on Aveline, he gave the faintest smirk as if her silence amused him. "You'll get used to it," he said once when she failed to answer a question he hadn't really asked. At table, Duke Bernard presided like a judge, his booming voice filling the space, his hands slicing the air as he spoke of taxes, treaties, and the failings of lesser lords. The women sat at the lower end, their plates filled and refilled by servants, their opinions never solicited. When the Duke's eyes passed over Aveline, they lingered a beat too long, not in admiration, but in appraisal. She could feel the weight of it, the way one might assess a horse for endurance. Helene's warnings came in the smallest gestures, a brush of her fingers against Aveline's sleeve, a tightening of her mouth before a conversation began. "Never look too pleased," she whispered once as Lucien recounted a hunting victory, "and never look too displeased. They remember both." Some nights, Aveline lay awake in her chamber, listening to the faint creak of footsteps outside her door. She thought of the other brides she'd seen in Montclair, now scattered across other palaces and keeps. Had they learned to smile like this? Had they buried their voices too? She began to understand that survival here was not about pleasing anyone. It was about watching, collecting, waiting, until the right moment came to do something with what she saw. And Aveline was watching everything. By the end of her first season in Dreux, Aveline had learned the value of stillness. It was not the passive stillness of a frightened child, but the deliberate kind. The stillness of a hand holding a blade beneath the table, waiting for the right moment to strike. In the council chamber, she sat beside Lucien during audiences, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes lowered just enough to seem deferential. She listened to everything. The flattery, the boasts, the veiled threats exchanged between men who pretended to be allies. She committed their words to memory as carefully as a scribe copying scripture, filing away which lord overindulged in wine, which merchant glanced too long at another man's wife, which knight winced when the Duke spoke his name. Lucien mistook her silence for dullness. That suited her. He liked to lean close during feasts, his voice low enough for only her to hear, dripping with jabs meant to sting. "Careful, wife," he once murmured, as she passed him the wine. "If you keep sitting so straight, they'll think you have a spine." She met his gaze and did not look away. She saw the flicker of irritation, almost confusion, before he turned back to his plate. At hunting banquets, when the hall reeked of meat and smoke, she began locking eyes with the Duke's oldest allies across the table, just long enough to make them shift in their seats. A child bride's gaze should slide away. Hers did not. It lingered, calm, unblinking, until they looked elsewhere. She never spoke unless addressed, and even then her answers were short, shaped to sound harmless. But every smile she gave was measured, every tilt of her head calculated, She noticed how people leaned in without meaning to, how they tried to read what she was thinking and failed. Helen saw it before anyone else. One morning as she laced the back of Aveline's gown, she said softly, "You're learning faster than I thought." Aveline didn't reply, but she caught Helene's faint smile in the mirror. Her acts of defiance were so small they could be dismissed as nothing. She left Lucien's letters unopened on her desk for days, claiming she'd been too busy with embroidery. She stopped lowering her head when passing the Duke in the corridor, letting their eyes meet as equals for the heartbeat it took to cross paths. Servants began treating her differently too, not with warmth, but with the cautious respect one gives to a locked door that might hide anything. The court had wanted a bride who would disappear into silk and ceremony, her voice no louder than the rustle of her skirts. What they had instead was a quiet figure who heard every word, saw every gesture, and seemed to be waiting for something they could not name. And though no one could yet say why, the air in the great hall felt heavier when she entered. It began with glances, not the quick, curious kind she'd known in the early weeks, but longer, searching looks, as if people were trying to read her face for signs of something they couldn't name. In the corridors, servants stepped aside quickly, their chatter dying as she passed. Even those who once offered small, polite greetings now kept their eyes on the floor. Margot of Calais, who had never been easily intimidated, started delivering messages through Helene instead of facing Aveline directly. Father Gerard avoided her entirely. The priest who had blessed her wedding bed with words about duty and obedience no longer met her eyes at Mass. He seemed to study the altar instead, his prayers louder and quicker when she was present. Rumours began to circulate in low tones, fragments she caught when walking past open doors, that the princess did not sleep, that she could recite conversations word for word weeks after they were spoken, that she had written letters no one had seen and sent them with riders whose faces the guards could not describe. Aveline never confirmed or denied anything. It was on a moonless night, when the palace lay in uneasy quiet, that she heard the conversation. Her chamber was near the west gallery, where a narrow balcony overlooked the inner courtyard. She had risen to drink water, and in the silence, voices carried, Lucien's sharp and restless, Duke Bernard's low and clipped. "Montclair has no reason to keep sending grain if she produces no heir," Lucien was saying, "and if they withhold it, the truce is worth nothing." "Then you had better find a way to keep Montclair pleased," the Duke replied. "Your mother-in-law plays a long game, and she will replace her pawn if she must." They spoke of her as if she were not flesh and blood, but a piece on a board, one that could be swapped out without ceremony. She listened until their footsteps faded, until the courtyard fell silent again. By morning she had made no outward sign of what she'd heard, but she began to move her own pieces quietly. Helene was sent to the kitchens under the pretense of arranging her meals, and returned with more than recipes, whispers about the Duke's debts, the names of merchants growing impatient for payment. Margot, pressed into delivering small parcels, learned which corridors were least guarded at night. Neither woman asked why these details mattered. To the court, Aveline remained the same, a silent, dutiful wife. But in the stillness of her chambers, she began weaving a net from the fragments she collected, tying each thread to a name, a weakness, a moment that could be used later. And in the deep hours of the night, when even the wind seemed to hold its breath, she lay awake and thought not of escape, but of how a single well-placed pull could bring the whole net down. It happened in the middle of a feast. The Duke's favoured adviser, Lord Vauclin, had just finished boasting about a trade agreement with a distant port when the hall doors opened. A courier strode in, boots still dusty from the road, and handed a sealed parchment to the Duke. Bernard's heavy brow furrowed as he read, the colour draining from his face. When he looked up, his voice was cold. "Vauclin, You will remain here after the meal." The room shifted, conversations faltering, forks resting mid-air. No one dared to ask why. The accusation came later behind closed doors, but word spread faster than wine through linen. Treachery, misuse of funds, letters exchanged with Montclair's enemies. Vauclin swore innocence. His voice, usually so smooth, cracked as he denied each charge. But the evidence was undeniable, though no one could say exactly who had provided it. In the days that followed, the court swirled with quiet speculation. Some whispered that Lucien himself had orchestrated it to please his father. Others insisted it was Queen Isabeau, pulling strings from Montclair to weaken Dreux's alliances. But more and more, the glances turned toward Aveline, the silent princess who'd been seen speaking ever so briefly with a certain merchant weeks before the scandal broke. Lucien noticed those glances too, and it unsettled him. He began watching her more closely at table, his eyes flicking to her face when a new rumour reached the hall. His remarks to her grew sharper, less playful. "Careful, wife," he said one evening, his voice low enough to hide the tremor. "They'll think you enjoy this." She only met his gaze, the faintest tilt of her head suggesting a question he couldn't answer. Meanwhile, messages from Montclair began to arrive. Short, formal notes from Queen Isabeau addressed to her daughter. They contained nothing overt, just commentary on the weather, news of harvests, small gifts of silk thread. But each carried a single, deliberate phrase: "Hold your position." Vauclin was dismissed from court within a fortnight. He left Dreux in disgrace, his estates confiscated, his name spoken only in cautionary tones. Life in the palace returned to its usual rhythms, but the air had shifted. The Duke seemed more guarded, his conversations with Lucien sharper, his temper quicker to spark. Those who had once dismissed Aveline as ornamental now regarded her with a careful neutrality, as though unsure which side of the wall she stood on. Helene, brushing Aveline's hair one evening, allowed herself the smallest smile. "They're beginning to see you," she murmured. Aveline said nothing. She didn't need to. The first crack had appeared, and she knew exactly how to make it spread. The hall was warm with firelight, but the air felt cold. It was a feast meant to soothe tensions, a show of unity after weeks of strained silences and guarded conversations. The tables were heavy with roasted game and candied fruits, the wine flowing more freely than the words. At the high table, Duke Bernard's voice dominated, though it carried a new roughness, like a blade losing its edge. Lucien sat beside him, his smile fixed and brittle, one hand drumming against the wood. Aveline was where she always was, still, poised, her eyes moving from face to face. She had not spoken a single word in public since her wedding day. Some had stopped expecting it. Others whispered she had no voice left at all. The Duke was in the middle of recounting an old military victory when a single remark from a lesser noble shifted the air. It was about grain shipments, missing ones, and the merchants who had been left unpaid. The Duke dismissed it with a wave, but Aveline saw the quick glance he sent to Lucien, and Lucien's jaw tightened, just for a moment. The room felt smaller then, the clatter of cutlery suddenly loud. Aveline's gaze rested on the man across from her, a merchant lord whose debts she had quietly traced for months. He looked uneasy, his fingers whitening around his cup. She placed her hands on the table. The sound was soft, but it stilled the space around her. When she spoke, her voice was calm and clear, the voice of someone who had been waiting for the perfect moment. The missing grain was sold to Montclair's enemies, she said, her eyes never leaving the merchant's face. Paid for with coin from Lord Vauclin's confiscated estates, approved by the Duke's seal. The words landed like a stone dropped into deep water, silent for a beat, then spreading in widening ripples. The merchant froze. Lucien turned sharply toward her, colour rising to his cheeks, and the Duke stared, his mouth half open, as if caught between denial and fury. No one spoke. No one moved. The fire popped in the hearth, and it was the only sound. Then slowly the murmurs began. Not loud enough to be called accusations, but sharp enough to cut. Eyes shifted between the Duke, Lucien, and the merchant. None of them looked at her for long. Aveline lowered her gaze just enough to end the moment. The picture of composure. She took a sip of wine, her hands steady. By the end of the feast, no one was speaking of military victories. They were speaking of the silent bride who had finally spoken, and of the ruin her words might bring. That night, as she left the hall, people stepped back to give her room. Not out of courtesy, out of fear. The days after the feast moved like a slow tide, washing away what had seemed unshakable. Lucien stopped dining in the great hall. When he did appear, his eyes darted from corner to corner, his smile brittle, his words clipped. The easy arrogance he once wore like a cloak had frayed into something smaller, more defensive. Servants whispered that he had taken to locking his study at night, that he paced for hours, muttering under his breath. Duke Bernard no longer thundered through the corridors. His voice was quieter now, his steps heavier. Allies who once hung on his every word began excusing themselves from his company, citing business in other towns. At council meetings he found himself interrupted, his proposals picked apart with the same precision he had once used on others. From Montclair came a different current, small but unmistakable. Queen Isabeau's letters grew warmer, laced with the faintest thread of satisfaction. She never mentioned the feast, never referred to the blow Aveline had struck, but her gift spoke for her. A comb inlaid with gold, a bolt of silk the exact shade of winter sky. Hold your position, they seemed to say. The rumours about Aveline spread farther than Dreux. Courtiers from neighbouring realms arrived with questions about trade or marriage, but their eyes always found her. They studied her the way one studies a locked door in a room where the air feels colder, curious but wary. She did nothing to correct their assumptions. She still spoke rarely, still moved with the same measured grace. But when she chose to meet a man's gaze, he looked away first. One morning, months after the feast, she ordered her wedding dress brought from storage. The maids hesitated, unsure if they had heard correctly, but Helene understood. The gown had yellowed slightly in the folds, the embroidered lilies dulled by time, but it still carried its weight, still pulled at her shoulders the way it had when she was 9. She wore it to the midsummer procession, not as a bride, but as something else entirely. As she walked through the sunlit courtyard, the crowd hushed. To some, the sight was unsettling, a reminder of the child who had once been paraded for the sake of politics. To others, it was a statement they could not quite name. The dress no longer marked the day her childhood ended. It marked the day they learned she could not be erased. And in the silence she carried with her, the same silence they had once mistaken for obedience, there was now something heavier, sharper, a promise that the girl they had tried to bury still walked among them, and she was watching.